Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to our event, Best Practices Enterprise Scalability. My name is David Huffman. One of the things that I wanted to just kind of start off with a little bit as to why we're doing this training and kind of what this is going to entail. A lot of this has to do with not necessarily, the usage of the software. We do demos and training about, how to use things from a technical standpoint of how to set certain things up. And we're going to do a little bit of that today, but what really we wanted to kind of focus on was some of the features that we've added to the product over the years that are usually direct result of customers. And these are customers, a lot of times our larger enterprise customers. That's some of the features that I'm focusing on. These are features that they had requested or was basically added to the product to assist them. And so this is really geared for people who are already fairly knowledgeable of the product itself, but there are maybe some hidden features that maybe they've never utilized or wanted to learn a little bit more information about it. So we're going to kind of go over those. Some of this stuff may very well be aware of, and it's not going to be any news to you. And but I would hope that at the end of this, there will be a few things that are like, okay, wait a minute, I didn't know about that, or I hadn't utilized that, or maybe I knew about it but didn't actually do it. And so maybe it'll give you some ideas and different ways where you can kind of become a power user of the product. In larger environments, kind of utilize some of these additional features. So, first off, you know who our product is. It's a backup product, backs up the OS, gives you the capability of disaster recovery using adaptable system recovery process. Those are just kind of our basic features. But really, what we're going to kind of go into more is the fact that more than just a bare metal utility. There's a lot of backup management features that go with this, and some of these backup management features may be things that you may or may not be aware of, and that's what I really wanted to go over today. First off, if you're not familiar, obviously we have the web-based GUI that you can use. We have a web interface. We have an X-Windows-based GUI, and our recovery is menu-driven, but also we have our command reference guides, and if you're used to using the command line. We have other trainings in the past we've done on command line power users, so that recording is available, so you may want to look that one up if you're curious about that. Today we're going to mostly be focusing using the web-based interface, but more we're kind of talking about a higher level approach to the product as far as how you would kind of structure some things. Now, as you may or may not be aware, you may already be writing your backups. I'm assuming this is because this is about enterprise scalability. We're already using the network edition or the TSM edition. You're writing your backups over the network. But if you're currently writing them to a storage server, you may also be not aware that you can write them to a TSM server or an NFS server. The TSM integration was added several years ago, back in 2007. That was for customers who were already a TSM shop. Oftentimes, they'll utilize our product in conjunction with another backup product like TSM or Commvault or something else. They'll use our product for the bare metal recovery portion, and then they'll use a different enterprise backup product to handle just their data, the user data. And so what was happening is we had a number of customers who were creating their storage backups, writing them to a storage server, then taking TSM, and then backing up the backup. Now, it seems like a fairly simple process, to do that, a little two-stage backup, no big deal. The problem occurs really when you come down to recovery. So when you go to do recovery, you have to recover the storage server first, then you need to recover your backups from the TSM server back to the storage server, then you can start recovering your clients, and that's where it becomes a mess. So that's why we added our integration with Tivoli Storage Manager. So we can write directly to the TSM server, and when you go to do your recovery, you boot off your bootable media, you point to the TSM server, and you get your system recoveries back. So that's kind of to talk a little bit about your different options here. Plus, obviously, physical, virtual, AIX, Linux, Solaris, doesn't matter, but I want to kind of point this out. Also, we've added the ability to write to NFS servers. We've had that in the past, but it was changed a little while back where you can set up an NFS shared server. So it basically appears as a server in your configuration. We're going to kind of show that a little bit. Now, when you're booting, most people are familiar with, making your bootable ISOs. You may already be familiar using that. It also can just be an ISO file, so if you want to copy that around. Obviously, tape boot if you're on IBM Power, whether it be AIX or Power Linux. Disk boot, you can take a slice off the SAN, USB drives, that sort of thing. and then network boot. We're going to really talk about network boot or focus more on that right now because you've got different options and different ways to do this. DHCP, BootP, or RARP or RARP. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our backup management. Now, in the basic, now this is kind of an interesting thing. We see this a lot of times. We'll have customers who we'll be talking to on the phone, and they'll be customers for years. And all of a sudden, it'll come up in conversation with one of our tech support reps about having a second backup server. And they're like, wait a minute, you mean my admin is not my backup server? Or, yeah, my admin. Yeah, my backups are all going to my admin, or my backups are all going to my backup server, which, again, gets confused as their admin and so forth. And so one of the things to really understand is that, yes, you can write all of your backups to a single backup server, which also can be your admin and also is your boot server. And you do your network restores from that one particular system. However, it really limits you as far as your scalability because you're having to send all of these backups across the network, maybe into different network segments or geographically separated. So it's going to be a lot slower. You know, the ones that are local to that system might be really fast, but then once you start traversing your network, things are going to start slowing down. So if you had multiple networks, let's say, well, do you want to have an admin in every single one of them? No, that's not scalability. That's just, keep piling on more systems. No, what you want to do is you want to have your admin server kind of able to speak across these other networks, and you set up a backup server and maybe in these different network segments or at different data centers, however you have it set up. So that way you can write to more than one location, all right? And so what this is going to do is it's going to speed up the backup and speed up the recovery because you're going to be working within the local network, maybe even within the same subnet there. But again, from a management standpoint, from that administrator that you have, and that administrator doesn't even have to be a backup server. Again, a lot of people think, well, I need my admin. No, you don't need your admin as far as to be a backup server or during even the recovery process, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Now, one of the things also is that this is very modular, so you can really break this thing up. So a lot of people say, well, my admin is also my backup server. It's also the system that I do my booting from if you're going to do network boot. Well, that doesn't have to be the case. And this is where that functionality comes into play when you start getting into larger environments, because when you're booting from Linux, well, we'll go into that in a minute, but when you're booting Linux, you're talking about pixie booting, which limits you to the same subnet. So wait a minute, how are you going to do that when you've got multiple subnets that you need to traverse? So your admin server can be separate from your backup server and can be separate from your boot server. It's simple to have them all three the same, but you may need to you may want to break this out. So you have one system, maybe even just sitting in a VM somewhere that's your admin, and then you can have multiple backup servers in each network segment and even set up separate boot servers, to kind of traverse your network as well. Also, for offsite recovery staging, we added the capabilities of doing copy backups a little, we've had copy backups for a while, but now you can actually schedule that and make that part of your job. So when you're writing your backups locally, that backup can automatically get copied off to a server sitting in at the offsite DR location, or maybe in a different data center if you have, twin data centers. We see that an awful lot in larger environments where, hey, I've got two different data centers and I'm going to share backups between them so that way I have redundancy. And that also acts as their DR site oftentimes. So in the event of a failure, obviously, then you're able to go ahead and recover your clients because your backups are already sitting at the offsite location. Again, that's something you can schedule within your backup job. Now, when you start getting into, more complex networks, maybe these networks are, they're not on the same subnet. You've got larger environments. And so with certain, again, as I mentioned earlier, you can kind of break this up. You have your admin might be on one network, your backup servers on another, and your boot server maybe, somewhere within that subnet because you need it for being able to do pixie booting or DHCP booting. So let's talk first a little bit about AIX. If you're going to be network booting AIX, AIX is the most flexible and the easiest to deal with because whenever you're booting an AIX system over the network, you go into the SMS menus, you set the initial program load or IPL, And you can point to servers that aren't on the same network. It's not doing a broadcast protocol. So you can be on a completely different network. You go into AIX and you specify, hey, I want a network boot off of this particular box. And that boot server can either be an AIX system or a Linux system. It does not have to be another AIX box. And then when you do your recovery, so you can say, again, you can boot from one system and recover from another system. And so your backup server, where all your backups are stored, could be a Solaris box, could be AIX, could be Linux, could be an NFS share, could be the TSM server, doesn't matter. So if you set up a particular boot server, again, it can be AIX or Linux, you can boot that AIX system up. And again, for AIX, really nice, it's using boot P. It doesn't have to do broadcast, so you can actually put it on different networks. Linux, okay, Linux becomes a little bit more of a problem because you're doing PXE booting, which is a broadcast protocol, which typically means you need to boot within the same subnet. Now, there are ways around that, and that's a bit more complicated. But when you have large environments and you're traversing multiple subnets, what do? Well, again, any system that's configured as a client can also be added as a server, and you can add it as a server just for the functionality of the boot, for a boot server. So you can be booting off of a system within that subnet and then recovering from your backup server that's on a completely different network. And again, recovering from Solaris, AIX, Linux, NFS, TSM. You have a lot of options as far as where you want to get your backup data from. And for Linux, you can boot either from AIX or Linux. For Solaris, if you happen to have Solaris systems that you're managing, Solaris is a bit unique. It uses RARP for booting, which is also a broadcast protocol. But Solaris booting is limited to another Solaris system. However, that's only for the boot portion. It's not for the recovery portion. So in the case of Solaris, you would just have a different Solaris box in that subnet you would be able to do your network boot from. But then when you're actually doing your recovery, you can recover that again from Solaris, AIX, Linux, NFS, TSM, doesn't matter. So your backup server, where your backups can be on kind of any platform you want, and when you're setting up your booting, you can set up a boot within that subnet. So when you're getting into large environments, we're talking about, hundreds of systems. We've got customers that are upwards of, 1,500 systems within their Storks environment. You have their administrators that's managing everything. And again, you set up your different network segments where you can have your boot server, either AIX, Linux, or if you have Solaris systems, it would be your Solaris boot server. And you can boot within that local subnet, but then when you actually go to do the recovery and you want to get access to your backup data, you can then go across subnets to get to it. And again, that limitation of being able to having to boot within the same subnet is a limitation of PXE. It's just because it's a broadcast protocol. However, because of the flexibility of being able to separate out the backup server from the boot server from the admin server, again, you just designate a system to be your boot server, but you don't have to make that where all your backups go either if you don't want to. Well, what if you're not wanting to boot over the network? Okay, well, obviously we'll go back to ISOs, USB drives, things like that. But you can boot off of the ISO, but then still get your data from the backup server. Even boot from a USB drive or a USB stick, and then once you're booted up, you can go across the network, either Solaris, AIX, Linux, TSM, or NFS. And then non-SB admin network restores. Now, this is the one that's important to recognize. We go into it here. Is when you're booting, now remember, as I mentioned, your admin and your backup server can be completely separate systems. And at the time of recovery, when you boot off of your bootable media, whether it be an ISO or you boot over the network or however you're booting that system up, notice there's no access. You don't need to access your admin. Okay, a lot of people are like, well, I need redundant admins and this and that because I may need to do a recovery. Well, the admin is not required to do the recovery. And this kind of highlights that when you boot off the bootable media, let's say you boot off the ISO, you can immediately point to the NFS server or the TSM server to do your recovery. You don't need the admin. You don't need a Storks server to do your recovery from. So you can immediately just boot that system right up for your recoveries. Or it could be a Storks server. Again, it doesn't need to have the admin. So when you've started breaking out your servers and you have all these different servers and different networks, again, you boot up that client, access the server, get access to your backup data and do your recovery. The admin is not even a factor. All right, user management. Okay, so One of the things that the product has is the ability to go in and create users. We also have a groups feature. And actually, why don't we talk a little bit about the groups feature, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over first, and we're going to use the web-based interface here. Let me go ahead and log in. And we'll talk a little bit about groups, and then that way it'll lead us into users. Okay, so when you typically install the software, we create a default group for you called main. That's your main group. And that's usually where you got all your servers, you got all your clients set up, but once you start getting into larger environments, this becomes a little unwieldy. You know, if you've got 500 clients, typically you break them up in your environment, either by line of business or, you know, the administrative group, or this is dev versus prod, or whatever it may be, your tier 1 systems versus your tier 2 systems. And so how would you break that up within Storix? Well, you have groups. So you can go in and configure different groups. And so right now I've got 2 groups. I've got the main group, which is originally set up, and I've got the dev group. All right, so I've just created another group, and it comes with a group ID that's generated. It's a unique identifier. And so as the group admin, or actually as the sysadmin, I'm logged in as the system admin right now, that user, I can go in and switch groups to dev. Now I went in and changed the theme within the web interface. I just changed the theme for this group. It would look exactly the same, but I went in and changed the theme so that way you could see when we switch back and forth between 2 groups. In fact, a lot of people do that. They'll change the theme of the other groups so that way they know which group they're in. Although it says that, I'm in group dev right now, it just makes it a little easier sometimes to see it completely separate. So in this particular group, I've got this client, I've got offsite server, and I've got this devices where I can write these backups to. So this is kind of my environment that I've set up for dev. And so I'm only going to see those servers, those clients that I want to see for in my dev group. All right, now when I switch back, and I go back over to my main group, Chargers is not in this list. And also I have Padres and Aztecs, completely different environment. So thinking about it, it's almost like, hey, I wanted to install multiple copies of my admin because I wanted to manage different systems. Well, no, I can get away with having one copy of the software installed, but I can break it up into multiple groups. Now, when I go to, so one of the things also here, now with servers, let's say I've got my groups here, and I've got Padres and my TSM server. Let me switch back to my other group here, go to dev. All right, now I've got this offsite server configured in my dev group. All right, I'm just kind of making these names up. But this server here, what if I wanted to share that between groups? All right, not all of the servers, backup servers I might want to share, but maybe there's one in particular because that's the one that's at the offsite location or something. So I want all my groups to be able to use that. Not a problem. I can go in, and when I go to my server configuration, it says groups allowed to access the server. You might have seen that and may not even known what it was for. Well, now I've got multiple groups here, so I'm going to go ahead and select them both. So now this server can be utilized between groups. Now clients are limited to a particular group. You won't have clients in 2 groups. That's the whole point of separating them out. But you can have a shared server. So now when I go to switch groups, I go over to main. Now, as you notice, offsite server is not configured as a backup server just yet. So I'm going to go ahead and add that now. And the first thing it says is, wait a minute, this server was previously configured from another group. Although you've been granted access, you will not be able to change any of the settings. So there is a group owner or a server owner. So in the dev group is the owner of this server, but the other groups can be allowed to utilize it. Let me go ahead and save that. So now offsite server is available to me within a different group, even though it's owned by the other one. So now, getting back to user management, because this is important. Now we start talking about groups here. You've got different levels of users that you can add to the system. Now, these are not system users. These are actually users that when you log in. And so you've got a backup user, They're basically limited to just kind of looking around, checking out, what backups have been run. This is kind of your junior sysadmin coming up guy. You don't want to give him keys to anything important. And so they would go in and they can actually just monitor the backups to let you know there was a problem. The backup admin can go in and actually configure some backup jobs, has a bit more responsibility, but doesn't have complete, access to everything. The group admin has a complete functionality as if they're a super user, but they're limited to a particular group. So that group admin would have full access, but only within that particular group. And then you've got the system admin. Hey, he's a super user. He's got all functionality across all groups, and he's also the one that can switch between groups. All these other options don't allow you to actually switch between groups. You've got to be the sysadmin to be able to do that. So when we head back over here, and I've got my users, so I've got Joe and I've got my storage user. Joe is in the dev group, and he's just a backup user. That's all he has. So if I go in here and log out, I'll log in as Joe. Okay, my default group was the dev group, so that's immediately where it put me. And if you happen to look up here, if you're familiar with this, pretty limited as far as what I can do. I can run a backup job, I can verify a backup job, but I can't go in and restore data. I can't remove backup labels. I can look at them, but I can display the clients. I can look at the job information, but there's really not a whole lot you can do. If you go down here and try to change anything, you can actually go in there and look at all the configurations, but it's going to say, nope, sorry, you're not actually allowed to go in and make any changes to it. Now, if I log out as that user, I log in as my other user, hey, I'm back to the group that I'm in charge of. In fact, I can actually switch between groups. Okay, so there's user management. Now let's talk a little bit about pre and post backup scripting. How are we doing on time? We're doing good. All right, so one of the things that, people often do, they'll utilize the command line utilities. Oftentimes they're writing their own scripts around our command line interface, whether it be adding clients and servers and things like that. And again, we kind of go over that in more detail in our command line power user sessions. But what I'm talking about is incorporating your own custom scripting into our software. Sometimes our software is wrapped into your scripts. Well, I'm talking about wrapping your scripts into our software. It's kind of a little backward, a little different approach here. Now, we have a sample script that we make available to you. This kind of explains everything. And so for the location of those sample scripts, if you're AIX, it's going to be user LPP storix samples prepost.sample, opstorix samples for Linux and Solaris, if you look in there. And you can find kind of just a sample script that kind of gives you a little bit more information about exit codes, what environmental variables are set. And so, in fact, you can see here, we can talk a little bit about these environmental variables. Why would you want to have these scripts run? Okay, well, you might have some functionality that you want to add, your own type of logging or your own type of notification, something separate that you want to incorporate here. And so there are some environmental variables that are set as we're going along. So, which client we're particularly on, or what is our backup server and device, what job we're talking about, what is our backup ID, what is the exit code of the backup itself. All of this gets put into the environment. So if you have a post backup script, you can then, you'll have the exit code available to you because it's an environmental variable. So now where do you put whoops. There we go. Now, where do you put these scripts when you want to run them? Well, it depends on if you're going to run a client-side script or a server-side script. So let's go ahead and first let's look at where you would use this as in your backup job. So I've got a weekly backup job here, and you've got the view customize. This is under profile, depending upon your profile. You can also add this to your regular profiles, but I'm going to do this for a custom. All right. And if you look in here, it says enter programs to run on each client. So you may already be familiar when you run a backup job, you can specify, multiple clients. So let's say you've got 5 different clients that you're going to run your backup job actually backs up. You can put a script onto each client that may be individual or, unique to each one, or you may just add it to 2 of them, let's say. You're backing up 5 systems, but only 2 of them need to run the script. Not a problem. What the software does is it looks in a predefined location for that backup script, and if it does exist, it'll run it. If it doesn't exist, it ignores it. Okay, so it's not a problem. It's not going to fail your job. And then you also have programs to run on the server. Okay, so why would you have, okay, well, wait a minute, why are scripts on the client, scripts on the server? I don't really understand. Well, the ones that are going to run on the client may be unique to that particular client. So you want to run something locally on that client, you know, Quiesce database or whatever you're going to be doing at that moment. And then you have one that you want to do at the start of the job. Okay, so one of them is going to be at the beginning of the backup of that particular client. One of them is going to be before you do anything. So I've heard of customers who actually use this to go and grab a particular tape. You know, they're handling tape management a little differently, or they want to do their own tape management. So it'll go in and grab a tape and throw it in there prior to actually starting the backup itself. So that way they're keeping track of that. Or maybe notify users or whatever they're going to do. So again, you can use that script on the server side, which will be at the beginning of the job, and then you can put one on each individual client, and it'll run at the beginning of each backup of each client. So where do you put those scripts? Well, those scripts are going to be located in a custom directory, and you may not have known this exists, inside your Storix data directory. Now, by default, that's /Storix. Okay, not the location of the executable. That's going to be either opt Storix or user LPP Storix. I'm talking about where all your backup configurations, all the configurations for that particular host, whether it be a client, server, or admin. And that's going to be your Storix data directory. And again, that's /Storix by default, but it's user configurable, so maybe different in your case. And then inside of that is going to be a directory called custom. So you would want to place your script inside the Storix custom, make it executable, and then you can place them, you know, for client-side scripting, you put that on the client. For server-side, you just put it on the server in that same location. And then when you're configuring your backup job, you just specify the name of it. You don't give it the full path. That's why we have that custom directory there. So that way you're not allowed to actually put in, you know, the name of my script and then RM-RF and all this other stuff. No. It's going to go and look in that particular directory for that script, and it's just going to run that script by that name. Okay? So it's not going to, you know, you don't have the option of just putting in any old path that you want to within this configuration to run on each client. So that's kind of a security concern. That's why we want to make sure you're just naming what script you want to run. We're going to be getting it out of that directory and that directory only. Okay, and as I mentioned, the pre and post backup scripting in the environmental variables, these are some of the variables that are set. So maybe you're running, you know, you need to know, okay, which server am I writing this to? Maybe you want to do that for any kind of reporting that you need. Now, speaking of reporting, let's go ahead. One of the items that we had on our agenda today was email notification. So let's go into our general preferences, and again, this may be something you may or may not be aware of, but your status notification information, you know, basically when the backup starts, or if there are any messages as far as when the backup ran, or did it exit complete, was there a warning or something along the backup. And so you're able to go in and select and say, okay, well, you have your default settings. When you want to send information, you can specify your email address or a log that you might want to send it to. You can specify that in your configuration. But also we have status notification options, and by default it just shows everything on the screen and writes it to a little log file. But you know, it's just within the interface. But you can specify that you want to have this information sent to an email, sent to a separate log, or both. And you can even specify what type. So for this particular use, I've set it up here. I want it to mail to my email address, but the only messages I want are errors. I could get all the messages, warnings and errors, or just errors. So, hey, just send me the errors via email. I'll be fine there. Or I can say, well, no, I want to append to a file, and I want errors and warnings sent to this log file. or I can just utilize the same configuration and say, nope, use them both, okay? So I'll get an email for any errors, plus any warnings along with errors will be sent to the log file. So I can go ahead and save that. And then when you're configuring your backup jobs, let's go in and look at our job here. Again, going back to that view customize in your backup profile, I can also specify print or send backup labels when complete. Well, okay, I can have that sent because I've already configured an email in my preferences where I want things sent. I can have that backup, you know, the backup label itself emailed to me at the end of the backup. So not only do I get, you know, maybe status information, basically what I would see on the screen as far as backup started, backup completed, that sort of thing can be emailed to me, but also the backup label, which is going to include information such as what clients were backed up, what was the data that was backed up, the time the backup started, the time it completed, any return codes as to, you know, did the backup complete successfully, and so forth. Okay, so it looks like we're about end of our time here. So I want to thank you very much for attending our training session. And what we're going to do is we're going to open it up for Q&A. I'm going to go through those Q&As. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Go ahead and stay on if you have more questions.